Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'll do the second part of the Economics of Privacy lecture. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about this first paper is Google Evil, Knowledge Commodification, Community and Innovation. So this is a working paper. So just as Alessandro Acquisti is really focused on the economics of privacy, David Zetlin's really focused on water. Think about water economics. And actually that's how I first found some of the papers that Zetlin had written. And I used to do a section, maybe I will, in some versions of the course, I'll do a week thinking about the economics of water. And there's a lot of really interesting ethical and then economic issues around water. So it fits into the course nicely. But then I found this paper, which actually provides a really interesting perspective on thinking about Google and thinking about search results. And Zetlin raises some really interesting issues that I then like to explore. And I think that's really relevant for thinking about the economics of information lecture here specifically. Then I'll talk about this paper, Measuring Price Discrimination and Steering on E-commerce Websites, which is really interesting, thinking about the ways that firms had been using and continue to evolve in their use of people's data and information online. All right, so the first paper, Zetlin wants us to think about the effects of rapid access to information on our lives, specifically with a focus on Google in particular. And one of the things we want to recognize, I think I mentioned in the previous video, how it's a little bit unusual, the level of information, sort of the rapid rise of the accessibility of information. So when I was growing up, I mean, originally, like when I was a little kid in our household, we had an old Apple IIc, and it didn't connect to the internet because there wasn't an internet, at least for ordinary people at that time. And then, during early years of school, we got the internet at my school, but only the teacher could use it. Only the teacher could send information to other classrooms. We had like a sort of pen pal arrangement with other classrooms. So we do science experiments and they do science experiments and we pool the data together. And I just thought the whole thing was ridiculous. And I really just wanted to be outside for recess. And then ultimately, like that was like elementary school. By middle school, there was like computer labs. And then by high school, we had a computer at home hooked up with access to internet. And then, by college, I mean, I went to college at the same time as Napster started. And so anyway, so that was my first year of college. The first semester was like when Napster was getting big. And so then by the time I graduated, of course, then there's Google and Facebook and everything else. So it's kind of a really interesting relative to my own interaction with information and then thinking about economics of privacy, thinking about the way that people interact and then release information to companies that are then able to make use of it from perspective of price discrimination, but then also in terms of the different ways that our behaviors and our purchasing decisions and consumption patterns are shaped. I think that's really important. Well, before we even get to there, we can think about the role that people have in terms of interacting and then creating the information that's then released to other people. That's really important through the way that Google and other search algorithms work. And so you could think of the ways in which people's search patterns and search histories is relevant for what they see and then what other people see. This is really important. So Zetlin's focusing on Google and says, well, all right, Google has the potential to weaken ties to the community and reduce our capacity to innovate. And while these externalities are small, they should be opposed. So Zetlin's arguing that these are kind of two of the detrimental aspects of Google. Firstly, weakening ties to the community. And then secondly, reducing our capacity to innovate. This is interesting. Writing in 2005, think about now 15 years later, what's been the case? Well, yeah, I mean, maybe. People have been, I'll go through what Zetlin's talking about. And I think a couple of the reasons why I like this paper, though it was written in 2005, is now thinking about the degree to which these things have happened or have become reality in the ways in which it hasn't. I think it's really important then to think about carefully the way that Google has and internet more generally, social media has affected community. So I was going to say something. I'll hold off those views until I kind of talk a little bit more about what Zetlin said. Some of the early objections to Google, we're talking about like the way that it was ranking pages, reducing in particular that it sort of narrowly focused. You kind of get an echo chamber effect where people wouldn't have access to dissident, minority, or heterodox views. And then also Google's dominance reduces users' ability to compare, contrast, and weigh different perspectives. And so this had been kind of one of the early sort of criticisms or worries that people had about Google, is that people would have this sort of really laser focused search results, and then people wouldn't get so much a wealth of information, but they would sort of reinforce their existing views. You'd get a lot of confirmation bias type stuff. I think actually, so Zetlin was arguing that wasn't what happened. I think actually maybe that's becoming a little bit more true. And so I think this is sort of like a perennial worry with the way that search results work. I mean, of course, because the way that the search algorithm is geared to give people the most relevant view or most relevant results. How does it determine that? Well, it determines on the basis of your own search history and those that have searched similar terms. And so there's a sort of reinforcement algorithm. Anyway, and then Zetlin thinks about the example of Starbucks and considers the fact that if you Google Starbucks, well, you come up with the main Starbucks site, the corporate site, but then you also come up with some sites that are critical of Starbucks. Now, I wonder to what extent this might have just been that Zetlin was Googling a lot of like anti-Starbucks stuff. Who knows? I don't know. You can go and Google Starbucks now, and if you come up with it, you get the Starbucks site, and actually these two don't come up anymore. I would not recommend clicking through those, because if these are sort of expired domains, they very well might, like so many other old domains, have been taken over by those with malicious intent. But anyway, so if you go through and Google, I'm not sure that you come up with a whole lot of like anti-Starbucks sites anymore. And so I don't know that this is that great of an example. I think in some sense, actually, maybe some of the sites that were critical of Starbucks could just be an artifact of one's own searching, which in itself is interesting, because then if you are interested in, if you are already inclined to exploring sort of the issue from the from the minority, dissident, or heterodox perspective, then maybe Google will reinforce that behavior, and over time, then maybe we could get the type of mechanism that Zetlin's expecting. Anyway, so also, Zetlin argues that Google actually helps people find other views. Well, for sure, like if you look for other views, you can do that. And hopefully, we're training up people to do that, that whatever side you take of a particular issue, it's really important to explore what the other side thinks. As objectionable as you might find it, it's really important to understand the arguments of the other side so that you can really carefully understand your own arguments. So indeed, yeah, Google is very good for helping people find opposing views. Further, Zetlin argues that Google is going to allow a wide variety of access to books and scholarly articles. That's for sure the case. You can use Google Scholar, you can go to Google Books, and through Google Books, you can get previews of a lot of texts that are really important. Like I'd almost never buy something from Amazon without looking carefully through the preview. And if Amazon's preview is insufficient, then Google Books almost always has what you'd be looking for. Google does think there's a worry about the reduction in links to community, and talks about like the lack of a shared experience and common knowledge, in the sense that, well, if people are no longer consuming the same information, such as the same local newspaper, although obviously like the sense of community is going to have to be really broadened, because you're thinking of this larger social media community where the people who have this shared experience and shared common knowledge with you and that are reading the same thing, it might not be that, you and all your neighbors are reading the same local newspaper anymore. That's probably not the case. Although like the people that you're interacting with might be not geographically local. They're local in the sense of sharing the same sort of ideas. So you can still get communities. And in fact, maybe you can get even wider and maybe richer communities by virtue of being able to have things like Google and social media, especially because if you're trying to identify with a particular group and find people who are like you, but who are not present in your own immediate geographic community, well, Google and then social media and then internet more generally is an awesome mechanism to be able to do that, right? Because if there's only, so think about like really small, narrow communities. So it could be like, think about somebody with the one that sort of comes to mind is sort of like being really salient as somebody who's got like some catastrophic rare disease, right? And so there's not very many people that have this disease, and because of its sort of dire nature, maybe some really important support system is going to be really beneficial to those individuals. Well, of course, maybe you have family and friends, hopefully, that are able to provide some type of support, but also via the internet, you're able to find those others sort of dispersed across the country or across the globe who are going through the same thing, possibly at the same time, or those who have gone through in different stages. And you have like the stories of people who have either been successful or passed on or whatever is the case. But you can see how like a numerically small community can still find each other and find itself by virtue of the internet. And so I think we want to think really broadly about what we mean about community, and the fact that I think actually, though maybe the local ties and the ties to the immediate community might be weakened, I think maybe some of the other community ties might be substantially strengthened. And also, I don't know how important immediate local geographic community ties, how important those are anyway, because I think people should be really geographically flexible. Although obviously that's like I'm very strongly biased there. And I understand that doesn't work for everybody. So, all right. Let's see. So Zetlin had been worried about people not reading the same newspaper. I said, I don't think this is a big concern, as I argue Google actually promotes this type of convergence of thinking. People tend to coordinate on the same sources. You can find your community. You can find those who are like you, those that you want to interact with via the internet. So that's good. And I think actually we get a convergence rather than a divergence of thinking from Google. So I think actually the concern from Google might actually go back to the original criticism against Google, which is like we might get too homogenous of views, right? So maybe people end up adopting and reading the same sources and then coordinate on those, and then that guides everybody's thinking. I see this because I see a lot of the same people post, or a lot of people posting the same sorts of things on social media, like coming across the same, obviously having read the same stories. Like if you Google like sports team or performer or like a location or whatever it is, like you're going to get the same type of results that anybody else is. And so if people are going to be, or you want to learn about whatever it is, if everybody's going to type in the same search query, they're going to get the same search results, and then ends up really focusing not only the inputs, but then also the outputs that we get through people's thinking, which is a really important issue and maybe not necessarily always good. All right, so Zetlin then worries about a reduction in innovation because we only get innovation in the case where the cost of the status quo is greater than the cost of searching for information. And he worries that, there'll be this sort of short-term reduction in creative thought, having a really long-term impact on the reduction in the capacity to innovate. So his sort of view is that it's actually really important for people to struggle with things and to work through and to be able to come to the conclusions after some effort's been expended, rather than having everything directly in front of them. So for this, I have a couple different perspectives. Firstly, obviously there's a lot of the things that people had to develop on their own, a lot of the understanding people would have had to have developed on their own is now readily available. And so, but on the other hand, there's this sort of efficiency argument where you're no longer searching for, it's sort of like not reinventing the wheel, so to speak, right? You're able to start at a further point and then hopefully be able to have a better starting point for future innovation. And I think we don't want to sort of understate that effect as well. Though I do believe that Zetlin's correct in the sense that it is really important for people to struggle through things and to not always look for the answer that's already been sort of spelled out for them. I think it's better, like the better use of information would be try to find the answer on your own and then try to verify it with what you're able to find. I think that's useful. So I had another professor who gave this, probably my favorite professor from college had the following advice in the math department. This math professor said something about how we could choose to be either archaeologists or architects. You could be an archaeologist in the sense that any math problem, anything on the problem set that he'd ever posed for us had already been solved, and you could, if you wanted to pour through library books, you could find all the answers. You could find the things already solved because there's only so many really good questions, and if you weren't able to find exactly the right answer, you're able to find something close to it. And so you could do that, and that's kind of just what you could do. You could go and search everywhere and try to find the correct answer, or try to find the help, and then you'd be an archaeologist. Or you could be an architect. You could try to solve the problems on your own. You could try to work from the principles, and you could try to have that sort of important interaction with the material in your own mind. And then ultimately, right, our goal isn't to solve problems that have been solved already. It's to solve problems that are new. And so it's ultimately like much better to strive to be an architect rather than an archaeologist. It's better to try to struggle through things on your own and come up with the right answer rather than take somebody else's answer. And so I think that's actually a really important lesson, and that sort of speaks to the value of education. And I think, right, the value of education isn't just your degree, it's what happens in your mind. And so it's really important that you sort of go through that relatively painful process of trying to struggle through things. And it can be frustrating, but it's really what's important, because it's sort of like the type of thing where if you never sort of stretch yourself, then you're not really going to be able to develop those capacities for the future. And I think that's really, really important. Okay, so relative to Zetland here, talking about, well, we're going to get this reduction in creative thought, reduction in innovation. I disagree. It's better to have more information at one's disposal and then use cognitive power to go beyond what's available. I think that's right. And I think that's ultimately how I feel about this, is like, it's better to have this wealth of information and then to be able to sort of like a relay, pick up where these other thinkers have left off and then go further. But that sort of depends on the individual's own composition and what they're interested in, what are their goals. So are your goals just to find answers, or are your goals to answer new questions, develop new answers and new knowledge? All right, so recommendations. Zetland suggests Google should offer a more complete search result to direct users to alternative views or supplement with offline resources such as local libraries, physical books. That's becoming sort of less and less feasible, definitely. I think there might be something to be said for this advice. Actually, I could see how this recommendation could work well if you had the feature where you could type in your search, and across the top at Google you have the whole collection of search results. There's news, there's images, there's books, and depending on how you arrange that menu, there's maps. Well, one of the things that they could do is they could have a tab that says like alternative views or less popular views or something like that. The problem is that could very quickly lead to directing people and giving more attention to like strongly objectionable views. And so I worry about that, and I worry about that suggestion of including alternate views, because so there's, on some issues, there's alternate views that I think are really meritable and need to be considered. I think other things equal, we like the idea of crowdsourcing wisdom. And I think it's bad if everybody just agrees with whatever is the prevailing opinion. Sort of history is littered with examples. Like, just look at the area of medicine, for instance, and thinking about like the development of germ theory years and years ago, right? Alternate views sometimes are the correct ones in an objective way. But in other cases, the alternative view is one that we probably don't want to give any more time to. And so I'd worry a little bit about this, but indeed, yes, Google could come up with more complete search results. I also, given the concern about some alternative views being strongly objectionable, I also wouldn't want it to be Google that would be sort of making the determination of which views would be suppressed and which views would be encouraged. I really don't think that should be the role of a company, and I actually really strongly believe that should not be the role of the government either. So Zetland suggests that Google enhance community sentiments with Google logo. Local. So note today, Google brings up a tremendous amount of Yelp or TripAdvisor results. Yeah. So if you Google Starbucks, for me, it's like the first thing that comes up actually is a McDonald's ad. So that's cool. The next thing is the map. So where I can find a Starbucks near me. There's lots of choices. And then there's other types of like, reviews or those sorts of things. And so that's good in terms of like building up community sentiments. To some extent, I don't know. So again, I think there's value in being linked up with your community, but I don't know. So I don't know that that's, I don't know that I have any much more to say about that. Let's see. So Zetland observes the internet has lowered information transaction costs, which could increase innovation. Says there's no longer a need to innovate. We must cultivate the desire to innovate. Oh, absolutely. Yes. So, I mean, we have to rethink the way that schooling works and think really carefully about developing critical thinking skills and sort of downplaying memorization type skills, right? And so you want to develop a memory for the right things. You don't need to develop a memory for things that you can find on Wikipedia. You need to develop a memory for how to find those things and then how to evaluate that data, right? All right, so think back to our discussion on strategic ignorance. Given the readily available information at our fingertips through smartphones, tablets, laptops, via the internet, ought decision makers research the potential consequences of their behavior in the moral sense before choosing? I mean, it's possible to research the companies we buy from, particular products, and the downstream effects of the potential actions. There's still a time cost. Seems like we haven't yet established a social norm for doing one's due diligence. Although I think this is increasing. I think maybe much more so today than 15 years ago. I think people are expected to kind of think. There's a greater expectation, I think, to be more aware of the world around us. Yeah, so I think this is interesting. You want to think back. I actually mean to pose this as a discussion. Can't actually do this here, but think about this. Is there a moral ought? Is it obligatory to search out information? I do. In a lot of cases, depending on what the product is, I'll kind of do a lot of research on things, especially to the extent that it's relatively low cost. Certainly not for everything. Kind of depends what it is. But I certainly do a lot more research about things now than I did 15 years ago. Although that could be the difference between, being in college and not. And so I don't know. All right. The next paper I want to go to is I want to think about the role of price discrimination. So we have this important observation that this data is really commercially useful and often to the detriment of consumers and consumer surplus. So from the paper, we realized, hey, there's a lot of e-commerce websites that are personalizing their environment using algorithms specific to the individual. And you're thinking about the structure. There is implicitly this sort of nudge based on the ordering of search results sometimes, and here we have it. So Netflix makes movie recommendations, Amazon makes product suggestions, so on and so forth. Google uses user's prior searches to report the results that are more relevant, right? Many websites personalize their content using complex algorithms, and this personalization is potentially advantageous to consumers, but it might also be manipulative. So firms could try to exploit these capacities for price discrimination, right? Trying to get as close to willingness to pay or to extract as much surplus as possible. So here's some examples. Orbit's travel website was shown to steer Mac operating system users towards the more expensive hotels to select or in the locations by placing them at higher ranks in the search results. So the website knows what you're using. They know if you have a smartphone, they know if you have a computer, and they know what your browser is. And this is important for the way that they optimize the site, but then also important for the way that they're arranging the results. This isn't saying that they were providing entirely different results. It's just that they are changing the ordering of the results, such that if you went down lower and lower, you could find other hotels that were less expensive. But if you were a Mac user, you were shown the more expensive hotels first, and then assuming that people are lazy, maybe they just would assume that this is an expensive area and they say, okay, that price makes sense, and then they just buy from the more expensive hotel. They discontinued the use of this personalization after a month. However, I mean, there's certainly, to some extent, there's ways that these the data, the fact that the browsing data and price discrimination is being implemented in ways that are maybe less transparent. Indeed, it's actually difficult to detect personalization on e-commerce sites, right? You could have two users run the same search and then look at differences in the results, and that could indicate some type of personalization, but there's a problem. You can get false positives. There could be issues with product inventory. There could be differences in taxes. There can be differences across data centers and so on and so forth. So even just running two users with the same search, there's going to be differences. Of course there is. So you have to think carefully about how to be able to actually empirically study the companies and maybe infer something about their use of price discrimination. So what they did in this paper is they used 300 real-world users and they synthetically generated fake accounts. The real-world users were hired via Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So via MTurk, you're able to put out, this is a little bit like Upwork, maybe a little bit more towards smaller sort of data tasks. But the idea is you could hire people kind of as, Upwork's a little bit more like true freelancers. So this would be like you'd hire people for small tasks. And so that's what they're doing here. They studied 16 e-commerce sites, so general sites, hotel, rental car, and so on and so forth. They find that 8 implemented personalization, and their control test allowed the fake accounts to identify the trigger for what was making the personalization. So they were studying Best Buy, CDW, Home Depot, JCPenney, Macy's, Newegg, Office Depot, Sears, Staples, Walmart. They also studied Cheap Tickets, Expedia, Hotels.com, Orbitz, Priceline, and Travelocity. They found Cheap Tickets and Orbitz offered reduced prices to hotel members. Expedia and Hotels.com steer a subset of users towards more expensive hotels, as mentioned. Home Depot and Travelocity personalized search results for users on most mobile devices. I think that's much more widespread now. Priceline personalizes search results based on a user's history of clicks and purchases. Right. So there's different types of personalization, and there's some really interesting issues and sort of trade-offs in terms of, well, sometimes this is going to be beneficial for the consumer in the sense of maybe allowing you to find some, to the extent that the company's guessing right, find more relevant results first. But then there also is a cost in the sense of they're able to maybe more accurately guess not only your preferences, but your willingness to pay, and then have prices that are going to be better, more beneficial for the company. All right, so the next one, the last one, thinking in terms of some of the limitations, the ethical limitations, thinking about the ways in which some of these issues are sort of borne out in real life. So there's this episode reported in the New York Times by Charles Duhigg, I think, who'd written the Power Habit book, and then also reported in a couple other outlets. So the basic issue was a Minneapolis area father found baby coupons sent to his daughter who was in high school. And the father was pretty upset and complained to Target. Turns out Target knew she was pregnant before he did. All right, so what had happened was Target had a statistician identifying 25 products that indicate a woman's likely pregnant when purchased together. And then the goal is for the company to sell coupons at a time when women are likely to purchase large quantity and form long-term shopping habits, especially like when they're, I don't know why that happened, when they're pregnant. Okay, so this is a really lucrative time to reach these individuals. And so like that's why they send those coupon books. And so then the question is, where's the line between creepy but still morally permissible and outright unacceptable? And so we want to think really carefully about, well, there's this data out there. This data in this case hadn't been specifically from that girl. It had been from a lot of other people and then had been used to focus this coupon book to that particular household. And so that's really interesting. First off, like, we think of this as being kind of creepy. Is it outright unacceptable? I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this. Not great, but it's interesting because I think this is the type of thing, and I like including this in the lecture for a variety of reasons. One, fits right in with ethics and economic behavior. 2, fits right in with thinking about information. And 3, it brings us to think about the use of information a little bit more differently. So the first part of the lecture, thinking about economics of privacy and then thinking about Google, is really focused on the individual. and the individual's interaction, what happens to the individual. This paper or this article is now thinking really carefully about the fact that, hey, look, this individual in particular hadn't really done anything in terms of interactions other than in terms of revealing information, other than fitting this profile that was constructed on the basis of information gathered from a lot of other people. That's really important because the degree to which you interact with companies and with the internet and put your own information out there is important. Firstly, because, well, it's affecting your future and your interaction with those companies. Also, it's creating this externality from the sense of being able to create this profile that then is used more generally for others with similar patterns. So there's a positive and a negative externality. The flip side of this is, for those who are really interested in safeguarding and protecting their privacy, you've got this other issue, which is that everybody else who's not safeguarding and who's not protecting their privacy, but who is sufficiently similar to you, is providing enough of a profile that companies are able to learn something about you maybe before those close to you know it as well, right? So this is really interesting. And I think that's important for the way that we think about privacy, especially because this makes privacy, in an episode like this, makes privacy not just an individual issue, but sort of a social issue. And this brings us right to the doorstep of kind of like a key economic social dilemma. It's a little bit like a prisoner's dilemma. Remember, with a prisoner's dilemma, the problem is the individual incentives. Everybody has a dominant strategy. The individual incentives conflict with the group incentive. When everybody plays their dominant strategy, the outcome is a smaller joint mutual payoff than if everybody were to play their non-dominant strategy. That's really important here, right? Individually, our beliefs and our propensity to share information, our incentives might be different than at the social level. And whereas it might be beneficial on the individual level to share information, it might be more detrimental on the societal level, especially when we get back to, I think, what we were thinking about, kind of the impacts of the ability for surveillance. So I think now here I was trying to be clever and go back to where I was talking about this right here, but I think this brings our sort of social dilemma aspect full circle. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll go ahead and conclude here. I'll see you next time.